welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Last year, President Obama proposed an initiative for free community college. And during this election cycle, Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders has gone one better with a plan for free college. At the same time, many college graduates are struggling to pay back the thousands of dollars of student loans that they've taken out, leading some people to call for student loan forgiveness. And underneath the calls for free college or the burdens of student loans is the rising cost of a college education. What will be some of the consequences of free college or student loan forgiveness? Joining me on EconVersations today to discuss these issues are Dr. Dan Smith, Associate Director of the Johnson Center, and Mr. Sean Alvarez, a Troy University economics major. Dan and Sean recently co-authored a column on these issues. Dan, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
And Sean, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, before we get started talking about student loans and free college, Sean, tell us a little bit about yourself, because you're now a Troy University student, but you actually were here at Troy before you enrolled.
Right, absolutely. I started taking university classes my junior year of high school as part of Charles Henderson High School's dual enrollment program. Mm-hmm. And it was my senior year which I started to take economic courses. Okay. My first one being Principles of Macroeconomics with Dr. Smith right here. And that's what started my burning drive for economics.
Well, economics is one of those things, if you catch the bug, you're usually stuck with that. All right.
Right.
Well, welcome here to Troy University. Well, to get started with, we've had these calls from both the president and one of our presidential candidates to essentially try to make college free. What would be involved with this?
So the first major issue of making college free is ultimately, where does the money come from? Mm-hmm. So because it's a federal program, we expect most of the burden to happen to taxpayers. So taxpayers would be the ones who would ultimately pay for these programs. And the question of how we execute of how the taxpayers will pay for them, mm-hmm. such as would be part of, let's say, an income tax, how we tax income, or how we tax Social Security, and furthermore.
So then basically the money would have to be coming from the federal government as opposed to the state governments?
Right.
And so when we think of these plans, and they're being described as free college, you've already mentioned this, there's going to be a cost to taxpayers, right? So from the taxpayer standpoint, they're not actually going to be free, are they?
No, not at all. As mentioned before, that it's not really free college, especially for the taxpayers, because the taxpayers are paying for it. Mm-hmm. The students are not paying for it, but the taxpayers are. So in that essence, it's not free. Well,
there's another sense in which you could ask if college is going to be free, and that's whether it be actually free for the students or not. And this would actually get us into sort of an important economic concept, the idea of opportunity cost, which I know I've taught about in some of my principles classes. But the idea that the students would still face an opportunity cost for attending college, and in that sense, maybe college wouldn't be free for the students. Get into this, what is exactly that economists mean when we talk about this idea of opportunity cost?
Right, so when economists talk about opportunity cost, it's the highest valued alternative to taking, let's say, for example, going into college. You forsake getting a job straight out of high school, such as mm-hmm. entry-level jobs. And when the mainstream typically associates the cost of going to college, they usually don't incorporate opportunity costs, such mm-hmm. as going straight into the workforce.
So you could, if you didn't go to college, you might be able to get a job working full time, and you'd make some money doing that, right? So you'd lose those wages that you could earn, right?
Yeah, and this could actually be pretty substantial over a college career. If you go to college for 4 or 5 years, you could potentially be earning $20,000, $25,000 in the private sector without a college degree, with just a high school degree. So over 4 years, that would represent maybe even $80,000 to $100,000 of opportunity cost that isn't being factored into the cost of attendance.
And so then compared to the cost of tuition, especially in-state tuition at community colleges or state four-year universities, that $20,000 opportunity cost a year is actually pretty significant, right? And so, I mean, that's why I think that the free college term is, I think, a little misleading or maybe intentionally so. It's actually probably better to describe these as zero tuition programs, right? You're not going to have to pay any tuition out of pocket.
Right. So when we see free tuition, we don't actually factor in other factors such as room and board, textbooks, living expenses, clothing, any of these other factors which would usually be which students usually live on. So
now, when we get down to the nuts and bolts of trying to put a proposal like this together, it would seem to me, because I mean, given that some of the universities across the country, some of the private universities like Sarah Lawrence College, which usually tops, recently years been topping the charts, they charge tuitions in excess of $60,000 a year for students, and then a number of state universities charge out-of-state tuition that's in excess of $40,000 a year. Given all the hundreds of thousands of students going to college, it would seem like free tuition, even for 2-year or especially 4-year schools, would simply break the bank. So I mean, is this actually a serious proposal? Or are you talking about so much money here that it couldn't possibly be done?
Yeah, so this represents, it could represent as small or as low as about $300 billion for some proposals for just zero tuition for community colleges, all the way to Bernie Sanders' full proposal, which would be free college or zero tuition costs for all colleges. That'd be more around $700 billion. That represents a substantial amount. Now, we throw around billions left and right, as you see legislators in Washington, D.C. spending money, and we may even be accustomed to that, and that may sound like, well, that sounds pretty reasonable, but it is a substantial burden that taxpayers would have to take on. However, it's not unprecedented. Politicians certainly have shown the willingness to spend on huge initiatives that prove popular with voters. So while it is a substantial amount of money, it would add significantly to the federal deficit. It is also something that isn't pie in the sky, and I could see politicians legitimately taking steps towards zero college tuition, at least in some capacity.
Yeah, I think particularly for 2-year colleges, because I mean their in-state tuition, which would be the only part you'd really have to reduce to zero, is already pretty low in most states. I think Tennessee's actually put a plan in place already to reduce tuition at their 2-year colleges to zero. So I mean, it would be, as you mentioned, a costly thing to do, not necessarily a worthwhile thing to do, but it's not so prohibitively costly that we could just dismiss this as ridiculous.
Yeah, absolutely. We cannot dismiss this. This is an argument that we have to take seriously, and it's not just coming from someone like a socialist like Bernie Sanders. It's coming from Hillary Clinton, a more credible and mainstream candidate.
Also related to the issue of free college is the problem of student loans. And student loan debt in this country is now at about $1.3 trillion, and many students graduate from college with $30,000 in loans or more. And some people actually point to this this very heavy level of debt that the new college graduates have as almost crowding out any other expenditures that they could make. So some people propose almost that we might need to forgive student loans as an economic stimulus. So does that make any sense?
So the reason why student loans, or the interest rates on student loans, are so high is because it's an unsafe investment compared to investing in gold or investing in real estate or any other investment as such. So the reason why they're so high is to prevent people from saying, oh, I'll get a college degree just on a whim. So if we forgive those student loans, sorry, we won't see economic stimulus. We can see the same example in 2009 with the Cash for Clunkers program that the Obama administration administered, in that consumers, instead of waiting a few more years to buy a truck, for example, they would buy a truck at that time. We can see the same for students entering college. They won't wait 5 or so years to enter college, save enough money to enter college. They'll do it at that moment.
And if we were to let students not pay back their student loans that they've already taken out. So I mean, this, and just to be clear, I mean, these proposals have been for people who've already racked up this student loan debt, to just say we're going to forgive your debts here. If these students stop making these loan payments, I mean, those loan payments were going to go to somebody, weren't they?
Yeah, and that represents a fallacy of this program, is that number one, so my wife got a doctorate degree in physical therapy. She racked up a substantial amount of debt paying for that degree, well worth it. But if government came in and paid it all off, I would move a truck that I'm going to buy in 5 years till today. So it just shift around where that consumption is going to occur. And the payments we're making is clearly going to people that invest in higher education, provide opportunities for new students, people that are buying trucks and buying products today, making investments. So you're really not going to add anything new to the economy. And furthermore, to pay for that all, you have to either raise taxes or go further in debt at the federal level, and that's going to damper the economy. So overall, I just don't see any argument that actually can credibly say that we're going to get some type of economic stimulus by paying off all our student debt.
Another issue that, since both the cost of college now, the calls for free college, and then the large debts that many students have had to incur to try to go through college, both these are ultimately related to the cost of attending college. Now, we hear a lot about the cost of college, attending college going up over time. Sometimes, though, statistics or things that we hear reported aren't always true. Is it actually true in this case? Has the cost of college been going up?
Yes, it has. The cost of attending college has risen, as shown, adjusted for inflation over the years. And the reason for such is adding other luxury amenities, such as luxury dorms, or a rock climbing wall, or a lazy river. These are other luxury amenities that students use, which are not academic based, but they see as being fun in their leisure time. Students nowadays spend around 300% more time socializing than they do studying, and that coincides with the trend of spending more money on leisurely activities.
Now, I guess one thing that some people might note about the numbers like this is that sometimes people make a reference to a net cost of college, that the full tuition sticker price is sort of like the sticker price on a car, and very few college students actually pay the full tuition price, especially at these private schools where the tuition might be $60,000 a year. Yes, you could conceivably pay that, but anybody who chooses to go there is often paying far less than that because they've gotten aid from the college itself. And so, but even I think if you look at these net tuition, or net cost of college, or net tuition estimates, it shows a similar picture, although maybe not quite this dramatic. Right. So we have this issue of the cost of colleges continue to rise, but as we get into this problem with student loans and as students asking for debt forgiveness, one thing the issue that this brings up is that back in 1965, when the federal government got into the student loan business, they had the Higher Education Act of 1965, and so here's a picture of President Johnson signing it back in that day. The federal government got into the higher education business, providing aid to students, because at the time people thought college was too expensive. There were concerns about the affordability of college and making college more affordable. And now 50 years later, we seem to have these same issues about college not being affordable for people, or access being denied. So it sounds like the federal government's been trying to solve this problem, but they haven't solved it, right?
Yeah, so you could definitely see whenever governments around the world have reduced the cost, the full cost to going to college, obtaining a 4-year degree, you've seen students take a little bit longer, go into into majors that have less demand on the marketplace. And why not? If the federal government's going to subsidize loans for you to take art courses rather than business courses, well, if the market values those business courses more and to a higher extent and is going to compensate more, most people, if they're paying for the full cost of that tuition, are going to choose the business route. But you're going to see more people move into those majors that don't have as high of a market demand, as long as you're subsidizing that tuition. Denmark is a great example where you see zero tuition college there, and students are taking increasingly longer, 5, 6, even 7 years to complete an undergraduate degree. They spend, as Sean has mentioned, more time socializing and less time on actually academic pursuits. One of our major problems, I think, with colleges is, as Sean has mentioned, they're competing against each other in kind of an arms race to attract students that are being subsidized by the federal government. And what I mean by that is they are building these rock climbing walls, these lazy rivers, these luxury resort-style living apartments in order to get students there. But is that really increasing the value of their degree in an academic sense? I don't know. It may be able, it's a great way to attract those students, but maybe not a great way to actually enhance the educational experience and what they're actually obtaining in the classroom. And I did want to mention a distinction is that the 65 Act was essentially creating vouchers, a somewhat voucher type program for student loans. Federal government will subsidize whatever college you end up going to. Some of the plans that like Bernie Sanders is talking about, where we're moved to zero tuition, I think represent a substantial threat to the autonomy of colleges, because it's going to be more centralized control, because rather than just a loan system, it's going to be you have zero tuition, and it's going to kind of damper the market and competition among universities, and I think lead to more standardization of the college experience.
I think that's an important point to get into. Let's see if we can get into that in some more detail, because as you mentioned earlier, Sean, these calls for zero tuition college are going to be funded by the federal government, right? Right. Now, we've had a strong tradition of public universities in the United States, but they're actually state universities. I mean, they're old, like Michigan State University or Mississippi State University. They have state in them because it actually indicates that that's the level of government that supported these institutions in the past, right? Right. And so if we move from having states largely support universities to moving having the federal government involved, that's going to change who's calling the shots or who's guiding this. And I think this gets into the point that you're talking about the possible loss of autonomy, right?
Yeah, and I think it represents a substantial threat, because states, they've been actually decreasing their funding for higher education. You've seen universities have to rely increasingly more on student tuition, donor support, and things like that. They certainly do not have the capacity or the political will to support zero tuition at the state level. It's going to have to come from the federal level. And as we know from almost every single federal program, with federal dollars comes all the little strings and all the conditions, and it's kind of a backdoor way for the federal government to control the curriculum, control tenure and promotion, a lot of dangerous things that we don't want the federal government getting involved in could occur, you could imagine, through this zero tuition proposal.
And I think that's important to point out, because in other nations where you have more centralized or national government control of universities, you have these very standardized policies. You have very standardized programs. There's like, in our field of economics, there's like one approved, it's called the Diamond List in the United Kingdom, and all universities have to apply this rank, or their economics departments are all measured against this one rank, which can be very important, very significant if you've got economists who disagree about the best way to study economics, or dissident groups of economists out there. So I mean, you can pose a lot of uniformity in this, and then there's also the whole issue of competition, right? Because state universities compete with one another for students, and they also compete with private universities too, right?
Right, so the main reason why I chose Troy was the generous chancellor scholarship that Troy awarded me, as opposed to other universities in the area. Well, that and the amazingness of the economics department. So removing that edge that some universities have over another it prevents universities from growing into fields that they wish to grow in, such as Troy with economics.
And that can be really important, because I mean, even if, you know, over time, if like 50 years ago or 80 years ago, if the top universities in the country, if you were to rate them or rank them somehow, even if that doesn't change over time, if the same schools stay on top but they face vigorous competition, then there's a better sense of actually recognizing that, well, they're probably still on top because they're doing something right. They're doing something that whether it be students or business or somebody or donors, somebody values and is willing to continue to support them. Whereas if you have one plan in place and you're allocating money according to that, you could lose out on a lot of this competition. Mm-hmm. Now I wanted to get into something that you mentioned, I think both of you mentioned earlier, and that is how it is that the actual existence of federal student aid and loans might be contributing to some of this rising cost of college. So that, you know, yes, we do have these fancy dorms and recreation centers now, but they might actually be there because the federal government spends supporting it or subsidizing higher education. Can you explain that in a little more detail for us?
Yeah, so through through state subsidies and then subsidized federal loans to students, we've already reduced the cost of attending college, the tuition costs for many college students. In fact, in America today, most students that have a strong desire and the ability to do well in college are able to get into a university, either a regional one, state one, or a city university. Fit in and succeed and do well. So there's a wide range of financial assistance through different forms of government to these universities. And a lot of it, as I mentioned before, is resulting in trying to attract students that already are paying a reduced price. Now, if a student was paying the full price of the tuition, I think they'd be a lot more discerning, and do I actually want to go to a school that's going to charge a much higher tuition rate but give me a national football championship team and a lazy river and a rock climbing wall? Some students may be willing to pay for that. Other students, on the other hand, may be looking for something more of a discount. I want the most educational, the best education I can get for the dollar, and they may choose a lower cost option where they can go to a school that doesn't spend money on those types of luxuries. But because government does subsidize students, they have less incentive to make that choice, and more willingness or more incentive to make a decision based upon something else, like which team has a better, which school has a better football team, or which one has better athletic facilities.
So when we think about one of the important issues for higher education, and one of the reasons why we've tried to reduce the cost of it, is to increase access, to make sure that people would have access to it. Now, I mean, as you mentioned, I think you mentioned earlier that you know, we've already done a lot in that regard, and so very many, most students who have the real aptitude to be able to succeed in college, even if they don't have the means to be able to afford it, now have some way to be able to access and get to college, right? And that's important in terms of trying to assess whatever benefits there might be from expanding the opportunity to attend college further, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's really important that they have some skin in the game. Still, if we move to a zero tuition type regime, they're not going to have that skin in the game, have less incentive to complete on time, less incentive to perform well in the classroom. We already have problems with that with some students that are already receiving subsidized federal loans, but I think that problem would get even more severe, as we've seen in places like Denmark.
And so I just want to add one thing in there in terms of in addition to the extra costs that colleges take on. I think there's pretty good evidence that's been put forward that the fact that this federal government has been subsidizing, in fact, subsidizing tuition or paying them for these student loans has led to states to cut back their funding for higher education. So we really have already had, to a large degree, a shifting of the cost of paying for higher education from the states to the federal government, because states have been able to, they know if they cut back their appropriations and tuition rises, well, that means the student qualifies for more federal aid, and the federal government will step in and almost dollar for dollar make up for the state budget cuts. And so we've seen appropriations from the states to their state universities dwindle pretty significantly.
Yeah, and I would bet if we move forward with either reducing tuition further or all the way, that we would, I suspect we would start to see a further increase in the number of administrators on campuses. We'd see nicer looking buildings, we'd see faculty salaries increase, we'd see the cost of textbooks increase. A lot of that money that we specifically try to get to students in the form of federal subsidies for loans doesn't actually end up getting to those students. And I think these new programs are going to suffer from the same types of problems.
And to some extent, this is actually a product of what's, I think economists can label the objective cost fallacy, which comes to this idea that somehow costs are set and set apart from the choices that people make in the economy, whether it be a firm deciding exactly how they want to produce their product, or for a university of exactly what they want to offer in terms of amenities. Because I mean, you could argue that if you had like a really fancy dorm room and maybe massages and other things to reduce stress for students, they would learn better. And that's probably true, but you get away from the important question of, is that increase in their educational experience really worth the extra cost? And so without, if you just assume that there's a cost of college out there and all you have to do is cover that cost of college, you miss out on the fact that that cost is actually a moving target because the costs aren't objective. And so that's I think, an important point, and it's a confusion I think we see a lot of times in policy discussions, right?
Yeah, I think it's clear that education, much like every other good, it's subjectively valued, and it can be, for different people, mean different things. And people can value the massages and the reduced stress environment. Some people might be willing to pay for it, but most people won't be willing to pay for it. The only way that we can really know if it's economically efficient is by putting it to the market test. That means, are you, the student, willing to actually pay the cost of tuition to attend that school that has all those amenities? And until we do that, we really won't see cost containment like we do in normal sectors. The cost of cell phones, the cost of TVs, everywhere else we look essentially, except for education, healthcare, a few sectors that government's involved in, we see costs decreasing. It's only in these public sectors where there's no incentives for cost containment, and that's because we don't really have a market context, that you just see costs spiraling out of control. So moving towards in the direction of a Bernie Sanders or even a Hillary Clinton type plan, I think will just further suppress that competition and what remains of the market in higher education. And I tend to think we'd start seeing education turn out more like, or higher education be more like K through 12 education, rather than be something that we're proud of in American society. Right now, higher education around in America is known around the world. But if we start looking like a K-12 educational system that's more, more dependent upon state control and more standard and uniform, we're not going to be known around the world for having the best higher education.
One last thing I want to touch on, perhaps very briefly here, is the fact that, as this one sign here shows, well, we seem to observe a lot of unemployment or underemployment of college graduates. It's emerged very recently as a phenomenon. Could that be tied to this attempts to lower the cost of college through federal loans?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there certainly could be a bubble in higher education because we're subsidizing it, and that's going to encourage more people to go into higher education. So you're going to start to see people going into careers that don't actually need a college degree because they went through college because they got subsidized loans.
Well, any last thoughts as we wrap up here? Anything that we've left out there I think you want to emphasize or tell us about?
No, I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and it's a really important topic, so I'm really glad that you brought us on.
And Sean, I'm sorry if we're not going to end. I hope, if you're taking out some loans here, I'm sorry if we've rained on the parade your dream of maybe getting those loans forgiven one day. So I hope we don't end up hurting you in that regard. But thanks for coming here to Troy University, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for tuning in. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.